Okay. Welcome everyone to this new event of the SOAS Center of Buddhist Studies. My name is Stefania Travagnin. I'm the chair of the center and the leader in Chinese Buddhism. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here and to welcome our speaker. Before we go into our speaker that my colleague Christian Luksanitz is going to introduce to you, we're going to say thanks to the Robert Hall Foundation. This is the very first talk of this academic year of the Robert Hall Foundation lecture series in Chinese Buddhism. Robert Hall Foundation has been supporting SOAS and the Center of Buddhist Studies for quite a few years already. We usually have 3 lectures per year, and every lecture is followed by a reception, but also a seminar on a Saturday morning. So it's a kind of double event each time. And it's usually 3 main events. One is about history, text, which is what we're going to hear today. The second, another event is more into art history and rituals. And then a third one goes into modern and contemporary China. So we divide it into 3 different topics and also different historical periods. That's, I think, all for the introduction. We thank Robert Hall Foundation, and I leave the mic to Christian Luksanitz.
Thanks and welcome from my side as well. I'm the senior lecturer in Tibetan and Buddhist art, and I usually do the Buddhist Forum, but since this is our second attempt to bring Max here, because the first attempt, as many of you will remember, had to be cancelled short term because of sickness. I'm introducing Max here, and yeah, Max is professor in Buddhist studies at Cardiff University, and I think, as his short description shows as well, he works since a very, very long time, I think all your academic life, on the different texts of Chinese pilgrims about India and all kinds of other subjects that are related to that. And one of the kind of remarkable things about for somebody who is bad in languages myself is Max is one of those people who speak many languages and use many languages in his research. And that is, of course, a major asset in that case. But also the variety of the subjects he addresses in his scholarship is extremely vast. Of course, many can be in the end linked back to this kind of intercultural exchange, the types of translations that are, or the processes of translations that happens in that intercultural exchange. And I think what links to my own interest, he's also going there, trying to see how do the accounts actually fit with the evidence on site, and I think we'll see some of that today.
Something like that.
When he talks about Bodhgaya. So please welcome Max.
Thanks a lot for coming. Thanks, my 2 colleagues. I was very glad actually to see both of them when I arrived. Apologies to those who tried to come last year. I really felt sick, very, very sick overnight, and there was no way actually to get on a train and to come. So I'm glad to be here pretty much 1 year later, isn't it? So it's about pretty much a year later. So I have to say, I pulled out the old PowerPoint and the old kind of text I prepared, a kind of disclaimer in the warning. I have something written here, but I may, experience-wise, I know how that works. I may leave that and start kind of rambling. It's the responsibility of these 2 then to rein me in, particularly when the time comes. So when I was asked by Christian 2 years ago, maybe, if I could come, and what I would like to present are, of course, what you call the pilgrims, the Chinese Buddhist travelers to India through Central Asia or through the sea route, actually were kind of on the wish list, I guess. But then I had to decide what kind of part of that relatively big field actually I would select. And I then had the idea of combining two projects I have been involved in, different lengths of these projects. One are these Chinese records. That's an ongoing decade-long project. And the other ones actually are also Chinese sources, but of a different kind. There are not records as such, not travelogues or pilgrim records, as they are very often called, but they come directly from the sites. And the combination of these two actually determined the site, the place, because that's Bodhgaya, that's the place where the Buddha reached enlightenment. So I will be talking about the Chinese sources about and from Bodhgaya, from the Long First Millennium. When I'm saying Long First Millennium, I mean that this is the first millennium that goes a little bit beyond the upper level. So it goes beyond 1000. So in Chinese dynastic terms, we are dealing with texts, let's say, between the Nanwei Chao, so the south north division of the empire, 5th century, all the way up to the southern Song, so 11th century. So that's why we are kind of going a little bit beyond the 1000 year threshold. So I've already kind of given up looking at my script. I think it's actually probably the best way to do. So when we are talking about the Chinese sources on India, of course, there are certain names that immediately pop up. And I think the most well-known is one I will be dealing with in more details, that is Xuanzang, the Tang period monk who went to India and left a relatively long record. I'll come back to that in a little bit later, on his travels in India that was extremely influential, not only on modern scholarship, on Buddhist India, because it was one of the few texts that actually told you where the places were, actually where you had to look for these places and what the places actually meant. But the text already, so 7th century text, already had a huge impact on the East Asian imagination of places which the Chinese call the Western regions, the Xi. That included India. If you look at the map, at the modern map, of course, you say, why is it called Xi? Why is it west? It's not west, it's actually further southwest rather than west. But they included in the Western regions. Another term for India actually is Jianzhu. By the way, the modern word for India, which is used in modern Chinese, Indu, which sounds very much like our India, has nothing to do etymologically with our India. It is actually a term that was introduced by Xuanzang, by that Tang monk, into the Chinese language, which has survived until today. So here you see the impact that even goes beyond China. You see here a so-called world map, or a map of India, of the 5 Indias, the 5 regions of India, which is of course Central India, East India, Northern India, Southern India, and West India. A bit boring, but that's how it's divided. This is a map from the Horyuji in Nara in Japan from the 14th century. My thanks go to Max Moorman, who gave me this picture and allowed me to actually use it. And it shows pretty much, it's the world, the Buddhist world. So it's a Jambudvipa, so you can actually see the rose apple tree continent, the kind of triangle, right? You have a little bit of more of the world up there. You have, now I have to, it's not 100% clear. Where is that one I'm looking for? You have somewhere the lake Anavatatta, which is somewhere more in the north on this map, from which 4 rivers flow out. And then you have India. And if you read the cartouches of this map, they are all mapping Xuanzang's record on a map. So it's following the record completely. And our place, Bodhgaya, is somewhere here in the center, so central. There's another reason actually for selecting Bodhgaya, because in certain Buddhist cosmological schemes, Bodhgaya is the center of the world in which human beings live. We come to how Bodhgaya looks in a modern context. Probably some of you have visited the place and know how it looks like. It is dominated, of course, by this huge shikara-like temple, the so-called Mahabodhi temple. And here you have a model from the 12th century, just around the corner, British Museum, the model of the Mahabodhi temple. And we come to some other specimens of these models that were obviously kind of used as venerated objects, maybe memorabilia from the place. If you go nowadays, they probably want to sell you these things as well. And you see how in the 19th century, after the discovery, and remember that these Buddhist sites in India were quite forgotten for a long time, for a couple of centuries after Buddhism disappeared on the Indian soil. A lot of these North Indian places that were linked, the so-called sacred sites of Buddhism, which were linked to the biography of the Buddha, so certain events actually happening at certain places, were forgotten and had to be retrieved in the 19th century by, I would call them proto-archaeologists in the Raj, in the British colonial period. So this is a picture, probably somewhere at the end of the 19th century, of the Mahabodhi temple. You see the western side of the temple with a slab that will still preoccupy us during the lecture, here kind of a stone slab, with some unknown Japanese gentleman standing there, visiting, and a person we know very much from the 19th century revival movement of Buddhism, that is Anagarika Dharmapala, the Sri Lankan self-declared Buddhist guru who tried actually to take the Mahabodhi temple from the Shaiva administration that was in place at that time. We come back to that as well. Okay, so a little bit about saw some images of the place, and just to point out what is important. So you have that slab. I will explain what that is and what makes it very important. You have a Buddha sitting here in meditation, so meditational posture, so cross-legged, with the earth-touching gesture, with the mudra, which of course is appropriate for Bodhgaya because that's where he reaches enlightenment, and that refers, of course, to that very important episode when Mara, the Buddhist archdevil, actually attacks him and tries to divert him from reaching enlightenment. He actually calls the earth goddess as witness. So he touches the earth, and then the earth goddess actually appears and says, yes, this guy will reach enlightenment. So in Bodhgaya, you very often have Buddha statues with that iconography. Am I right, Christian? Yes. So keep that in mind, because there will be a change of setting, which is important. Yeah. Interesting on this picture also is that the tree, the Bodhi tree. Doesn't look very old on this picture. And there's a reason that it doesn't look very old. So that's the end of the 19th century. The tree probably was at that time about 30-something years old. It may have been a sapling from a previous tree, but it's clearly not what is, if you go to Bodhgaya nowadays and they show you this tree, which is now very much grown and is kind of falling apart. So it's supported by pillars, so that it doesn't actually fall and crumble, is actually a relatively young tree at that time. Okay, let's go to the Chinese records. I told you already a little bit about that Tang monk, Xuanzang, the 7th century, who has given us the most detailed description of Buddhist India. But there were predecessors. Some of you may know the names, and the earliest of these, and that's also the earliest text that I worked with, is Fa Xian, who traveled probably between 399 and 412. Relatively early, so more than 200 years earlier than Xuanzang. His record called the Foguoji, the record of the Western kingdoms, of the Buddhist kingdoms, or with a slightly more boring title, the Gaozeng Fa Xian Zhuan, the biography of the eminent monk Fa Xian. This text is older, but it's also much more compressed. It's very short. So the proto-archaeologists I referred to in the 19th century, who were actually using these texts to find the Buddhist historical sites, would have had problems just with Fa Xian's text, because it's not as detailed as the other text, Xuanzang's record of the Western region. So here's Fa Xian's description, at least a part of it, of Bodhgaya. 30 steps in front of the tree, that is of course the Bodhi tree, a god donated the grass called bliss. In Sanskrit that would be swastika, with the bodhisattva, which the bodhisattva accepted. So it's referring to all these episodes, but you can already see in very kind of condensed form. It doesn't really go into the details of the story. It just says this is the place where this is the place where that happened. So when he had gone, the bodhisattva, another 15 steps, 500 bluebirds came flying, circled around the bodhisattva 3 times and flew away. That's the sign that he's on the right path towards the right tree, because he's made, according to Fa Xian and other texts, an attempt before to sit down and meditate and reach enlightenment, and the gods came and said, this is not the right place, you have to leave, go to the right place. The right place, of course, being the place where all the Buddhas of the past have, and all the Buddhas of the future, there's only one Maitreya, actually will reach enlightenment. So all Buddhas actually, this is one fixed place, the center of the earth, where all Buddhas reach enlightenment. So also our Buddha has to go there. So the Bodhisattva moved on and reached the place underneath the Ashwatha tree. There he spread the grass called bliss, and sat down facing east. That's also an interesting observation here, that he's facing east. Thereupon King Mara sends his 3 beautiful young daughters from the north to seduce the Buddha. King Mara himself came from the south to tempt him. The Bodhisattva pressed his toes against the earth. Thereupon the armies of Mara retreated, and the 3 young and beautiful daughters turned into old hags. From the place where the Buddha practiced austerities for 6 years, so that's pre-enlightenment, to the place mentioned before, people afterwards built stupas and erected statues which still exist today, where the Buddha viewed the tree in contemplation for 7 days, that's the weeks after the enlightenment, in enjoyment of enlightenment after having realized enlightenment, where the Buddha walked in meditation underneath the Ashwa tree from east to west for 7 days, and so on and so on and so on. All in these places, of course, stupas were erected. Where the gods transformed into humans, erected the pedestal of 7 precious items and made offerings to the Buddha for 7 days, where the Naga Muchilinda entwined the Buddha for 7 days, where the Buddha sat on a square stone underneath the Nyakroda tree facing east, and God Brahma came and asked him, sorry for the slip, to teach the Dharma, where the 4 divine kings offered him the alms bowl, where the 500 merchants gave him honey gruel, where he converted the 1,000 disciples of the brothers and masters Kashyapa. Everywhere stupas were erected as well. So you can imagine how that place actually must have looked like. It must have been scattered by commemorative stupas that marked places where certain episodes in the life of the Buddha, or in this case, around enlightenment, happened. The Sangha and the population received plenty of offerings, and there is no shortage of anything. So that, of course, pointing out that this was a very important place where a lot of pilgrims came. So the economic situation of monks living around there actually must have been quite good. The monastic discipline is rigid, and the behavior, the way of sitting, standing up, of entering the gathering of the monks has been like in the Sangha of the Arhats at the time when the Buddha still dwelt on earth. Another point, of course, kind of highlighting the fact that this is a special place. No? The monks behave properly. Comes on stage, Xuanzang. 603, some people say 600, so there's a little bit of a discussion when he was born. To 664, he traveled between 629 and 645. That's pretty sure. This is the normal, typical iconography of the later medieval period, where he's shown with a kind of a rucksack on the back, where you can see the sutra scrolls, these round things that he brings back from India. So he's obviously here on his way back, and this slightly silly lamp dangling in front of him. That's certainly not how he looked like. And he's popular enough, not only in the East Asian context, but also in India. And that's quite well demonstrated by the fact that he got a little comic book for himself in the famous Amachitra Katha series. So here you see, by the way, a scene from Xuanzang's biography. So he's one of the few monks who has a very kind of elaborated biography. I would rather call it hagiography, which of course also comprises the journey to India. And this is a scene where he is at the river Ganga. He's taken, is captured by robbers, followers of the goddess Durga. So he's supposed to be sacrificed, to be killed. And then he said, yeah, give me some time, I want to prepare for death. And then he kind of falls into meditation, and the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara appears, and all the robbers, of course, are converted and everything's fine. By the way, these kind of stories are not reflected in Xuanzang's own record. So the record of the Western regions of the Great Tang, that's his own autographic text, where he is written himself, don't contain any reference to the author himself, except for two important passages, but the rest is all kind of descriptive. Now, descriptive in inverted commas, because it's not just like that. It's not that it's a description of the places. As we will see, you will have actually to tweak the text and the context a little bit to make, in some cases it doesn't work, in some cases it works, to make the text fit, for instance, the archaeological evidence. So the Da Tang Xi Qi, the record of the Western world of the Great Tang Dynasty, is a text that Xuanzang submitted to the throne in the year 646, less than 1 year after his return from India. And that's important for the interpretation, it is a commissioned text. It's not something he did voluntarily. Saying, now back, I'm writing for my Chinese fellow countrymen, I write something down, what I've experienced, what I've seen. The emperor, the second emperor of the Tang dynasty, Taizong, actually ordered him to write the text. Before he could do anything else, first you have to write this. Give us a report of what you have seen. Yeah? So that's important, as you can imagine, for the interpretation of the text. Because, of course, what he does is, in some case, collecting intelligence. Because that's what the emperor was probably after. He wanted to know what's going on in these other countries in the West, Central Asia, but also in India. Emperor was not very much interested in India, but on the Western side of the Chinese Empire, just to get the intelligence to do what emperors do, conquer. Yeah. Which then happened actually during the time when Xuanzang was away in India. So between 629 and 645, the Tang Empire actually pushed very strongly into Central Asia, what is today's Xinjiang. So, a map of Xuanzang's journey in India. I'm not completely happy with this map because it pretends that the green lines, that this is the route that the Chinese monk actually traveled. In a lot of cases, we can't be sure if he really visited all the places that he describes. Yeah, so I would rather have a map with dots than having the green lines that pretend to actually show you the exact route of the pilgrim. But it shows you that he covers, or the text covers, pretty much of India. Yeah, particularly in the southern part, you see it's more peripheral, so it's going along the coastal line, it's going up again, coastal line. But here in the Buddhist heartland, East India, the Gangetic Plain, it's of course very dense. Why? Because of course there all these famous places were located where the episodes in the life of the Buddha happened, like here on the central, on the kind of more detailed map of the Gangetic Plain, the Eastern Gangetic Plain. So you have all the places that are mentioned in the Buddhist texts, in the Buddhist sutras, and in the Buddhist monastic code, in the Vinaya, where the Buddha is said to have done something, performed something. So we have, for instance, Lumbini, the Buddha's birthplace. You have Shravasti, where the first monastery actually was given to the Buddhist Sangha. You have, so that's not, of course, the real sequence, the biographical sequence, Kushinagara, the place where he entered Parinirvana. You have Bodhgaya, you have Bodhgaya, so the place of enlightenment. And you have Sarnath near Varanasi, near Benares, where he turned the wheel of the Dharma, so where he delivered his first sermon and converted the first monks. So what is now the connection between Xuanzang's text describing in a similar but more detailed way as we've just seen in the case of Farsian's text and the archaeological sites? Now we have to kind of dive back into the 19th century. A little bit of a history of the discovery of Buddhism as a religion, where the text, Xuanzang's text and the other Chinese texts actually played a major role. Here you have a picture of the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, Alexander Cunningham, who literally with Xuanzang's text, first in French translation, because the text was first translated into French in the 60s of the 19th century by Stanislas Julien, professor of Chinese in Paris. And then a little bit later, two and a half decades later, by Samuel Beal, a British sinologist who did actually not as good as a job as the earlier French translation, in my opinion. Anyway, so Cunningham discovered these texts, these translations, and saw the potential. Saw that with all the directions, with all the distances, with all the details given in that Chinese text, which you would not find in any Indian text, of course, there was a chance actually to harvest the landscape of India for archaeological remains. You can imagine, I mean, if you have a fixed point, you have determined one point, and the text gives you the distance to the next point and the direction, roughly. It's not always exact science, but at least you have kind of a grid across the map. You can actually hunt for these places. And that's exactly what Cunningham did, including our place, Bodhgaya, which he discovered relatively or worked on relatively late. You see, this is published 1829 and is actually the first archaeological, scientific, you could say, description of Bodhgaya, called Mahabodhi, or the Great Buddhist Temple, the Bodhi tree, Bodhgaya. And you can already see a certain bias which is in the title. So he's completely focusing on the temple and on the tree. Pretty much all the rest around it, we come back to that, is obviously not that much important to him. And we will see why that is. So this is a map of Bodhgaya from the book. And it shows you quite a lot of structures and features which are now, if you go to Bodhgaya, not visible, not there anymore. So the Mahabodhi temple is, of course, here. And just keep in mind that this map is north is left. So this is eastern, a bit like the old medieval maps, which all go direction Jerusalem. So this is eastern. Not sure why he did that. Maybe because the map then fits better to the format, could well be. So you have the Mahabodhi temple here in the center. You have structure here that will preoccupy us a little bit later in connection with the text and the archaeological situation. And you have a couple of water bodies, ponds, tanks, and some other remains, which he doesn't specify on this map. So it was obviously at that time, that was in the 70s when he first, of the 19th century, when Cunningham first went there, there was a little bit more visible than today. Now we're zooming into the site. This is the Mahabodhi tree, according to Cunningham, which is encompassed by a kind of a fence, a stone fence, which is partly going back actually to the Mauryan period, so the 3rd century BC. You got the Mahabodhi temple here in the middle. You got some kind of a strange thing here on the side. That's the so-called Chankramana Patha. So that's the path on which the Buddha is supposed to have walked up and down after having reached enlightenment. So you already see a kind of a pilgrimage structure, or a structure that obviously was relating to the episodes that Xuanzang, of course, also records. And all the way up, again, an eastern map, you see somewhere up the stone slab. That's the one with it. I think it's W something. Yeah. So keep that in mind as well. We skip that one. That's the same thing. So this is actually this pathway on which the Buddha is supposed to have walked in meditation after enlightenment, which is still visible. So if you go nowadays, you still see it pretty much in the same shape. This is a lake south of the Mahabodhi temple, which is nowadays declared as the place where the serpent deity, the Naga Muchilinda, actually protected the Buddha from a rainstorm by actually encoiling him and putting the hood on top of the Buddha, which is actually not the real pond. The pond was further, let's see, I have to find further south. So it's not this one. But this is how, of course, pilgrimage places develop. A certain meaning is ascribed to a place and then it stays. We can, of course, also not exclude that this happened in the past. Now, let's dive a little bit into how the place looked like at the beginning of the 19th century. And these pictures are all from the British Library. They are either available online or they are stolen from Michael Willis' article on Bodhgaya. He's not in the room, so I can easily do it. I asked him before. This is an anonymous painting of the Mahabodhi temple, and you can already see it's heavily overgrown, so it's kind of not really under worship or under construction. You can see that that's from the east. So east, that's the entrance. You see another entrance on top, which is now gone. It's not there anymore. So it looks very different after restoration, and the restoration happened actually in the 19th century. Even more overgrown from about the same time. And this one now is important because what we saw up to now is the eastern side. So that's the entrance which we saw before. What is important here is that this painting actually shows you a kind of an annex, a kind of a platform on top of which you have a Bodhi tree, much bigger than the one we saw on the other photo. Keep that in mind as well. And this is a detail of that tree on top of this platform, of this pedestal. Again, the same thing. So you have that pedestal, which is completely gone nowadays. That's gone. It's not there anymore. And the tree on top of it, the very old Bodhi tree. And these are the first photographs taken in the 60s, then later on in the 70s of the Mahabodhi temple, which is still pretty much in ruins. And the temple was started to be renovated in the 70s of the 19th century by a group of Buddhist Burmese gentlemen, as Cunningham calls them in his report. And they did a lot of damage to the site. So Bodhgaya is probably one of the most disturbed, archaeologically most disturbed Buddhist sites in India, because very early onwards, people who had no idea what they were doing, these Burmese people and others, were clearing everything around the Mahabodhi temple. The Mahabodhi temple was the focus, and all the rest actually was done away with. So Mahabodhi temple from the north, where you see the entrance here, you still see the platform and the tree, right? We go through the development and then link that to the text. The Mahabodhi temple from the northwest, when they already started to demolish the platform. And you see the tree is gone. Cunningham cut down the tree in order to clear the rubbish. And it's half done, so obviously he started somewhere here to clear. The tree is already kind of half cut, but still there. So that's actually before the photo, the previous photo. And this is now after clearance. So what he wanted to have, of course, was the lower part of the Mahabodhi temple in its original form. So what came out then actually was that stone slab underneath that we have seen before. Yeah. And a Buddha statue, which I show you in details in a moment, because this again is important. So this is now from the west, looking towards the Mahabodhi tree. You still see the kind of the platform partly here, so it's still under excavation, but you see the stone slab, and you see a relatively big Buddha statue, again in the seated position and with earth touching gesture. Now, this stone slab actually is called Mauryan. So it's coming from the 3rd century BC. People normally say very easily, oh, that's Ashoka, the famous Buddhist king who has actually erected this. We are not sure, but it's clear that it's from the 3rd century BC. So it's one of the oldest structures in Bodhgaya. Yeah. And what is interesting here is that I told you we are looking now from west to east. So this statue and the slab, they are on the western side of the Mahabodhi temple. The entrance to the temple is on the other side. So when you nowadays go, you go from east to west into the temple, and then you have a big Buddha statue inside. That obviously is not the oldest setup. The oldest setup is this one. Where the orientation is clearly west. So it's actually in contradiction to what we saw in Faxian and what also Xuanzang tells us in his text, that the Buddha was facing east when he was reaching enlightenment. So obviously a change has happened, and that's a relatively new discovery, which I just recently discussed with a colleague who is doing research in astronomy, Indian astronomy, and also Chinese astronomy, and has given me some information about texts that clearly show that up to a certain point, the idea was in certain Buddhist circles that the Buddha actually reached enlightenment facing west, not east, as the Chinese pilgrims, the Chinese travelers all tell us. It's east. And of course, it's east. If you go nowadays, the statue actually inside in the temple is looking eastwards. So we come back to this change of direction, sacred direction, you could say, a little bit later. So this stone slab, that's a detail here after excavation, is normally dubbed nowadays the Vajrasana, the Jingang Zhuo, the diamond seat, on which the Buddha is supposed to have sitten in meditation and reached enlightenment. As I said, facing west, looking in western direction. The Xuanzang's text actually, and we will read that in the reading class, the text itself, Xuanzang's text actually says something very different. It doesn't mention this stone slab at all. And Xuanzang says actually that the whole place, and he gives a diameter, it's pretty much the whole kind of surface around the Mahabodhi temple, that's the diamond throne. What does that tell us? That obviously Buddhist ideas about what the diamond throne, the Vajrasana, the Jinggang Cuo really was, were quite different from what we nowadays think. We nowadays identified with this because we have something concrete in front of us. Old Buddhist ideas were quite different. Why? Because the Buddhist texts tell us that I told you already, all the Buddhas reach enlightenment on that very spot. Now, because we know that the Buddhas of the past were much bigger than our Buddha Shakyamuni, of course the place also must have been bigger. Otherwise, none of the Buddhas of the past actually could have taken seat on that place. And that is probably behind Xuanzang's description that the Vajrasana at Bodhgaya is a huge place. Probably a couple of football fields together. Now, Xuanzang also tells us that north of the Mahabodhi temple, and he mentions the Mahabodhi temple. So remember, Faxian doesn't mention the Mahabodhi temple, Xuanzang does. So obviously there was already a change in the setup of the place between these two travelers, 200 and something years. Xuanzang tells us, and he's the only one actually to tell us, that north of the Mahabodhi temple, there was a monastery. And that monastery was actually donated by the Sri Lankan, by the Ceylonese king, in order to house the monks who come to the place and venerate the place, the Mahabodhi temple in the place. Now, Cunningham, if you go nowadays, there's no trace of that monastery. Cunningham at his time still had traces of that monastery, or what he actually interpreted as a monastery, and gave us a map. It's north of the Mahabodhi temple, and it has a very slightly strange structure. It has the monastic cells here, it has the central courtyard, that's all fine, but then it has some kind of round bastions on the side. It looks a little bit like on the plan like a fortress. Now, nowadays, we know that some of the other monasteries in the area in Bihar, where this all actually is located, have a similar setup. So that actually was a structure that really did exist. But where is this monastery now? Now, for a while, I've been working together with an Indian colleague, M.B. Rajani, who is a satellite archaeologist and does remote sensing. So he uses all the satellite imagery to actually trace structures on the ground, archaeological structures without excavating. And our cooperation normally works like that. She looks at a place and says, I got a problem here. I've seen some structures. What could they be? Can you look at the text and then we try and make something out? So you see again the importance of the text, because it's the only one that kind of gives us some information. And she did exactly that. She said, because I thought that the monastery. So here's the Mahabodhi temple. Yeah, this is north. So the monastery I thought was somewhere here. But she actually said, no. If I look at the map, archaeology, for satellite archaeology, I can see structures further up north. And they pretty much correspond to what Cunningham had on his map. We don't see the round bastions because, of course, that's probably not what we should expect, but at least we have a similar basic structure, and also the kind of size of that site is pretty much how Cunningham has shown us. Oh, sorry, here on this map in the Mahabodhi book. So the question, of course, now is, what do we do with that? And we only know about this monastery because Xuanzang describes it. Later on, an inscription was found in Bodhgaya, Sanskrit inscriptions, which refers actually to the foundation of a monastery at Bodhgaya through a Sri Lankan king, the so-called Mahanaman inscription. So without Xuanzang's description of the monastery, what the meaning of that monastery was to kind of host pilgrims that came, particularly monastic ones, and the information that came from Cunningham's report, we would not have any way of kind of contextualize that inscription. So it's kind of interpretative triangle. You have Xuanzang's description of the monastery. You have an old archaeological record by Cunningham, and then you have an inscription. And you bring them together, and suddenly you have a complete picture. There was a monastery which looked a little bit like what we see here. Excavation, of course, is a completely different thing because these places are heavily built on. So I think this is a school or something like that. There's a mosque somewhere here. You can't just go and say, now clear that space and now we dig. That's not possible. Of course, you have now modern methodology. You can actually do ground penetrating radar and things like that. So you can still find out certain things, which we have done in some cases on the ground. That's very helpful, but it's very expensive. So you need actually a lot of money to do that. But at least we have some clues. And we only have the clues because of the combination between different sources, and Xuanzang is one of the important sources here. And then we can reconstruct. So while, as I've told you, Bodhgaya is very much focused when you go nowadays on the Mahabodhi temple, on that huge restored with concrete, very ugly. In some, would you agree, Christian? It looks a little bit ugly at some point. This Mahabodhi temple, so sitting here. And all the structures around that Xuanzang describes, the place where the Buddha, or Faxian described, as you saw before, where the Buddha actually practiced asceticism, where he entered the river to take a bath after he decided that he now wants to become enlightened and start eating food again. All these episodes, there's nothing visible at the moment. It's a disturbed site, as I told you, but we still can try to reconstruct. And this is what my collaborator, the satellite archaeologist, M.V. Rajani, came up with. So again, in an email, she said, I have an idea. I read your translation of Xuanzang, so I give her my translations, pre-publication, and then she works with them. I have an idea. You say that the river, the so-called Nairanjana river, into which, according to the Buddhist texts and according to Xuanzang, the Buddha, for instance, took his first bath after his ascetic practices, should not be where it is now. Now the river, this one, the gray, is very close to the Mahabodhi temple. There's not much space between the Mahabodhi temple and the river. And I've never seen the river full of water. It's only full of water when during the monsoon. But anyway, it's clearly a riverbed. So there's not much space where you can put in all these episodes that are described in the Buddhist texts and also in the Chinese records, somewhere between the modern river and the riverbed and the Mahabodhi tree. So studying the texts, the descriptions, actually, I assumed that the river originally flowed somewhere else, further east. There is actually a modern river, which is still there. So if we take this as the river that is described in the Buddhist texts, we get space between the Mahabodhi temple and the river. And actually, there are quite a lot of archaeological sites on that other side of the river. So they have meaning. We still don't know exactly what the meaning is because they have not been properly excavated, but it's clear that there was much more on the site than just the Mahabodhi temple. And going a step further, Xuanzang describes that from the Mahabodhi temple, so inside where the statue is, there is a central axial road going from west to east towards the river. With this scenario, so the modern riverbed very close to the Mahabodhi temple, that doesn't really make sense. If you move the river to the east, like on this one, this is following Xuanzang. This is a reconstruction, schematic reconstruction of Xuanzang. So if you move the river to the east and you have all these cluttered spread archaeological sites, suddenly you get a kind of an axial structure. It's just the question then how to make sense of them. We are not there yet, so because of course the excavations haven't happened yet. Okay, so far that hopefully will give you a little bit of an idea. What time is it? Okay, we started a little bit late.
Yeah.
So much about Bodhgaya as an archaeological site in relation to the Chinese records. Now I want to switch, and now I'm exactly in the position I feared I would be, that for the second part there is not much time left. But so I will run you through a couple of interesting things, hopefully, which is Chinese inscriptions in India, in Buddhist sites. So from Xuanzang, there's nothing left. However, we have from the Tang period, not specimens of inscriptions from India, but at least textual references that some of these Chinese visitors in India actually have left inscriptions. We don't have the inscriptions, but we know that obviously they commissioned inscriptions and put them up in the sacred places. So it starts already in the 6th century in the northwest of India. We have a Chinese envoy going to Gandhara, to northwest India, Song Yun, who tells us that he erected an inscription at the place where the Buddha in one of his previous existences sacrificed himself to a tigress, a hungry tigress. Very famous Jataka story. Then around the time of Xuanzang in the Tang period, we have the fragmental record of a Chinese envoy to India, Wang Xuance, who was in Bodhgaya probably around 645. And the texts tell us that he actually left inscriptions. So this is the text where I've highlighted in red the place where actually the inscription is, it's described how the inscription is erected. By the way, we have the text of the inscription because this text mentions the text that was on the inscription. And what is important is it mentions the diamond firm, so the Vajrasana, the Jinggang Zhuo, and it mentions Maitreya, which is no wonder because we know about this Chinese guy that he was very much fond of Maitreya, so he was venerating the Buddha of the future, the Bodhisattva. So Cunningham, when he excavated the place, found Chinese inscriptions in Bodhgaya. And I've highlighted the places that he says he found them with blue. So that's the Mahabodhi tree. Again, in this case, it's north. This is north, so that's fine. So 3 spots where inscriptions, Chinese inscriptions were found. He also has pictures of these inscriptions. So they look like that. And of course, we would like to know where they are and how they look like. Are they still around? That's 1896 when he published his book. So you see there is a very big inscription. That's a lot of text, as you can see. And it is a very nice amalgamation of Indian iconography and Chinese writing. Because on top you have a clear Indian style kind of capital, right? With 2 marichis on the side, looking towards the Buddha, and the Buddha is, as you would expect in Bodhgaya, sitting in a vault and kind of with the earth touching gesture with a mudra that you would expect. And then there's a text that can be read. Not very nicely here, but you will see how that works out. 2 smaller inscriptions, these ones, bad pictures in Cunningham's book, but maybe 2.5 years ago, I was approached by a colleague who is working on the archaeology of Bodhgaya. And she asked me, it's Daniela Di Simone, who has been around here in London. Some of you may still remember Michael Willis' project. She was involved in that one. She's working on Bodhgaya. And one day she approached me and said, I want you to make a new translation and edition of these Chinese inscriptions from Bodhgaya. I said, yeah, well, but not with this. If I'm doing this, I want to have the originals. And said, yeah, I got them. And she sent me that picture. I said, where on earth did you get that from? So we knew actually that some of the inscriptions were in the Indian Museum in Kolkata. Years ago, I contacted the Indian Museum and said, you should have these there in the old catalogs. You should have these inscriptions, these Chinese inscriptions. Can you please look and give me some detail? And said, no, we don't have it. No, Daniela obviously was more successful. She got a hand on them. So she got very high resolution photos of them. So I couldn't opt out. And said, okay, you know, I have to do it. And I've seen the stones because when I visited the Indian Museum in Kolkata 2 years ago or so, they brought the stones down from the catacombs and showed the stones to me. So we now have, that's from that inscription, a detail, which we will deal with on Saturday. So the headpiece again, where you can see the Indian iconography of that period. And the period, of course, is the big question. Now, Chinese inscriptions, of course, have the advantage that they normally give you dates. So we know exactly to the day when these inscriptions actually were erected. Yeah. And all the inscriptions, there are in total, in Cunningham's book 6, and now we have 7. Another story where it is like a detective story. They actually are dated. So they are dated between the late 10th century and the first half of the 11th century. As I told you, a Southern Sung period. But one inscription actually is from the so-called late Han dynasty, which is positioned in the 10th century, in the second half of the 10th century. We have names. We don't only have dates, we also have names of these people who went there, who commissioned these inscriptions. In most cases, they are monks. And the most amazing thing is that some of the names on these inscriptions are appearing in Chinese Buddhist historiographical writing. So we have a match. We know, for instance, that one guy went to India several times. He was a kind of a travel guide, a monastic travel guide, obviously. And he shows up in one inscription and also several times in the Chinese historical writing from the 11th, 12th century. So, of course, very much insight into the practices of pilgrimage into a period where we don't have other sources. Yeah? So, other interesting pieces like this one, which is also now available again in the Indian Museum in Kolkata, which is a very odd one because you have again Indian iconography. You can imagine what that is. These are the 7 Buddhas of the past, including the Buddha Shakyamuni, and on the right-hand side, the Bodhisattva Maitreya, Mila, the Buddha of the future. And you have an inscription down here. I have to do this to read it. And again, we are getting information about, so that's a little bit teasing now. So Saturday, we will be looking into this a little bit more in detail. Again, we have names. We have pretty much everything. But as a highlight, so we'll skip this one and see it's available again. So this is a modern photo. I haven't seen that piece because they weren't able to retrieve it when I was there, despite my insistence. A rubbing. This one has not been discovered yet. That's only there in form of a rubbing. That Cunningham tells us that this inscription from the Sung period actually is, and this is the one where you have the monk who went several times, what I call the travel guide. This one is lost. We've tried, Cunningham says it's somewhere in the vicinity of Bodhgaya. It's in the precincts of the Shaiva Mahant, so the Hindu guy who's controlling the site. We've been there several times. We've not found anything. It may be somewhere, but we haven't found anything. Of course, that would be another highlight to detect that in the very end. But a couple of emperors. But what I wanted to show you is another one, this one, which is very fragmented, as you can see. It's just the capital, but you have the same kind of scenario as on the other one. You have the Buddha, very faintly visible, earth-touching gesture in the wall. You have 2 marichis, right and left. And you have the title of the inscription. So it's referring to the Jingangzuo, to the Vajrasana, and to a kind of canopy on top probably of the Buddha. So it's the record of the canopy of the Buddha and the diamond throne. And unfortunately, not much visible here, right? That was in Cunningham's book again. So we only had the rubbing until 2 years ago or so. My phone rang very early in the morning. 6 o'clock or so, because Indian time, they're a couple of hours ahead. I opened it, and a friend of mine who's working in the Bihar Museum sent me a photo that she had discovered in the holdings of the old Patna Museum, a photo like this. So they had a photo from probably the 60s or 70s where the piece was in the museum. Yeah, so it was there physically. And you see, it's the same thing. Even if you can't read the Chinese, it's clear that it's the same thing. Yeah, and then she sent me another photo, which is the piece. So they found the piece again in the catacombs. It was there. Nobody had registered them. No number, no nothing. But just, oh, this is Chinese. I'll ask Max. So I said, oh my God, this is the rubbing. And again, you can see that it's more broken than it was on the earlier one. So some damage has been done, but it's still recognizable. It's the same thing. Now, that's not all. Then she sent me another picture from the 70s, 80s maybe, of this piece, which was completely unknown until then. And I was intrigued. You see, just the Buddha, there are no marichis on the side. The title actually says that this is the foreword written by the Sung Emperor to the Sanzang Jing, to the Tripitaka. And there's a little bit, not here, but you will see in a moment, there's a little bit of text preserved here on this one. So the same thing, the next thing that happened was a photo from a piece that they found. That's what you saw on the previous photo. So you can see on this one, still some characters. Yeah, not much, but at least something. There must have been a longer inscription down there. Yeah. Now, because we know this title and we have the text in Chinese, in China actually, there is an original piece in the Beilin in Xi'an with this text. We can actually match the text that exists with the broken piece that we have here. So this is actually how an old photo, the same thing, actually showed even more characters. That helped, of course, right, to identify what we have, what we originally had as text. By the way, when I went to the Bihar Museum and I wanted to see the pieces, I thought that this piece and the other one, which looked similar, were two different pieces. They aren't. They are on the verso and the recto of the stone. A very rare occasion where actually two sides of a stele are inscribed. So, and it happened like that I went to the catacombs, to the caves, said, yeah, show me the piece. So they brought the piece out and they showed me this side. I said, yeah, but where is the other one? I said, yeah, turn it around. So it was one piece. I thought it was two pieces, but it was one piece. Now, what can we do with this one? Very fragmented. This is the Chinese text that is on that piece from Bodhgaya. And you see, it's a massive text. This was the text that was on that fragmentary inscription. So if you match that with the characters we have, and that's still puzzle work, you can see that on top, the red characters are the ones that are still visible on the stone, right? And now I've tried to match what actually what we have as the text, which is very imperfect because, of course, you would actually from the red you would have one line all the way down, but that actually gives you an impression how big probably the stone was. There was a lot of characters actually which were running down, all from the red to the bottom. So this is still a little bit of a mystery, but it's it has some implications on late Chinese pilgrimage to India. First of all, the focus was completely on Bodhgaya. They went to Bodhgaya, did their thing, and then they went home. Second thing that we know from the inscriptions is that these monastic travels actually were commissioned by the imperial household. because they mention that they did what we call in Buddhist studies parinama, punya parinama, the transfer of merits. The monks go do something to the place. They normally give silk, bowls of silk, they give money, they give this and that. And the merit that comes from that actually goes back partially, at least, to the emperor who commissioned the travel. So it gives us an insight actually into the early southern Sung period, which is normally described as a little bit kind of isolated. They were not so much interested about the world outside, which looks completely different. Sung emperors not supporting Taoism or Rujiao, Confucianism, but actually pretty fervent Buddhist supporters. This is what we actually can get out of these inscriptions. And I think here should stop. I do a little bit of more text work on the Xuanzang, on the Datang Shiqi on Saturday. And I will also do the longer inscription that I showed you here on these pictures. Thanks a lot for your patience and sorry for the rambling on.